So I'm supposed to talk about economics, and economics are really difficult to talk about in this area. So what I'm going to do is really talk about growth and which resins we think are going to grow and why. And this research comes from the Institute for Bioplastics and Biocomposites. You can download it off the internet. It's from late 2016. It has a number of fascinating charts and graphs in it, including lots of different pathways. So when Erin was talking earlier about, what crop do you use and how do you get there, this shows you the environmental impact of using potato starch or using corn or using different types of row crops. And looking at it, it's absolutely fascinating, and it really speaks to the point that she made that it depends. It depends where you are. And to Kim's point of, well, how much waste should we use versus how many crops should you use? It's a fascinating conversation, and I think that that conversation is going to continue to grow as we look at where these materials are going to come from and where are there waste feedstocks that can be used and where are there crops that can be used. So I recommend this to anyone. It's a little chemistry heavy, but it's interesting nonetheless. So this was fascinating to me to kind of look at where we've come from, but where the prediction is in terms of where the world is going. And I was actually astounded when I saw this chart, because what it said was that the materials that, I think that's backwards actually. So I'm going to switch to this chart, that the bio-based, non-biodegradable materials are absolutely going to dominate in the future. So this is the biopolyethylene, the bio-PETs of the world. And it breaks it down a little bit further, and you start to see, I know you can't read this graph, but it'll be available as a handout, but starting to have a look at which materials are going to be what part of the mix. But in 5 years' time, really significantly increasing in terms of the predominance of these materials, showing a much higher growth rate than we've seen up to now. So it really does appear, if this research is correct, that we've reached one type of tipping point. Drop in the bucket compared to fossil materials, but still a really impressive rate of change over the next 5 years. So the other thing that was really fascinating in this work was, where's it going to come from? And the idea that today there are materials being made in the US, in Europe, looking at the domination of the numbers of materials that are going to come from Asia. So then that gets back to, I was thinking of Erin's graphs with the US there and the moisture and the crops, but it gets back to I think the smart sourcing, in the sense of starting to ask those same questions as we do for other types of commodities, and trying to get an understanding of where are they coming from, what's the best thing to use in which area, because it was really clear that certain crops make much more sense in certain parts of the world than other parts of the world. So really this varied opportunity for different types of feedstocks. And then the other thing that was fascinating to me was, what are we going to do with it? So the large chart that's broken and off scale is packaging. So clearly, in terms of the areas of application for these materials, rigid packaging is huge, followed by flexible packaging, textiles, automotive, agriculture, consumer goods, then electrical and electronic. So you can really see that packaging is really forecast to be the dominant market for these materials. And one of the things that Adam mentioned earlier when he was talking about end of life, and I think it was someone in the audience that brought this up, I mean, one of the things I believe really strongly is end markets are absolutely critical to be able to recover materials. And whether that's composting or whether that's recycling, we as an industry need to do a much better job in encouraging value for those end market materials. And I think Composting is starting to get talked a lot, an awful lot more, but the benefits from compost, we still don't really value as a society. We value it in niche application areas and in certain sort of state and federal government programs that mandate the use of compostable materials. That helps create markets for composters. But if we really want to think about composting as an end of life, and one of the things that was fascinating to me was this idea that if we were going to meet our carbon goals, our global Paris Accord carbon goals, food waste was one of the biggest areas that if we could mitigate food waste and get it out of landfill and compost it, it gave us a huge push towards meeting those goals. So the idea of compostable packaging and the role that's going to play in getting food waste into composting facilities, I think is very important. But also this idea of learning to value compost itself and learning to recognize where it can be used, how it can be used, how it can improve our soils, and creating that value. Because once there's a value for it, then it's a lot easier to encourage cities and towns to collect food, compost it, and then use it on crops. And one of the biggest difficulties is the weight of carting food waste. And so if you can do it locally, it makes a lot more economic sense. And then from a recycling point of view, some of these materials, and PEF in particular was talked a little bit about, is very expensive today. So the idea that these materials have an inherent value, and if we attach an inherent value to any of the bio-based drop-in polymers, perhaps that's a way to help us also start valuing the collection of these materials, because today our biggest challenge is markets in the recycling industry and driving that collection. As Adam mentioned, we don't want it ending up in the ocean. We don't want it in landfill. But in order to sort of stop both of those practices, the material has to have a value. And I think biopolymers have that extra added value of being bio-based, and so maybe we can value them a little bit more. That's really all I had on economics, and what I wanted to do, we have a few minutes left, so I wanted to bring all the panelists back up so that we could have the opportunity to have them ask each other questions or give you a last opportunity to ask some additional questions.